Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's evening with Denis Stewart. And we have something very special for you tonight. Denis Stewart is a herbalist, which is named amongst the greats in Australia, and indeed some would argue the world. His passion for herbal medicine and his dedication and devotion to the health of his patients has seen thousands lead healthier lives. Spanning a career of over 35 years. And he's got such expertise that he's also been asked to formulate for quite a number of companies. And so I think without further ado, we have with us here tonight, if we could just give a warm round of applause for Denis Stewart. Now, I think just to start off, you should have with you your packs, and just to attention you to, there's the deal sheets in there, as well as a feedback form and some information about the products which we'll be speaking about tonight. So I'll leave you to browse through that at your will. So I think one of the other points is that Denis has also had a long history of teaching students as well. And I think that's the perfect introduction to Denis's history, because it wasn't actually herbal medicine that you were drawn to in the beginning. Like it wasn't a cut and dried choice for herbal medicine. You had another job beforehand. Is that correct?
Oh, that's a good statement. Yes, trained as an engineer, and that was a good training, because in so many ways engineering is very similar to medicine and very similar to herbal medicine. So I trained as an engineer, and I happened to be in Sydney at the right time when what was called in those days alternative medicine was taking off, and Sydney in the 70s was a place where a lot of smaller colleges were starting to flourish. Acupuncture colleges, people like Russell Jewell was teaching his pioneering course in acupuncture at Bondi Junction. I was fortunate enough to be able to study with Russell. The National Herbalist Association of Australia were a fragile group at that stage, but were conducting membership examinations, and I was able to mix with sufficient of them to be able to pick up, which wasn't a lot, enough for me to see that this association warranted support, and so through their auspices and my own personal study via a distance program from the United Kingdom, I was able to qualify with the NHAA, and my wife, who's with us tonight, and myself subsequently established the first serious, we would argue, the first serious course in herbal medicine in Sydney, which became the course accepted by the NHAA for membership purposes. And at the same time, that course was being taught by myself at the New South Wales College of Natural Therapies. And people like Stephen Sprada, who's with us here tonight, would have been one of my students doing it at that stage. So being in Sydney at the right time opened up avenues for education, allowed my engineering training to allow me to bring into natural medicine at that stage what I considered to be a more credible, and I hate to use the word, but a more scientific basis. Now, my argument these days is it's gone too far, but in those days we needed it. So from engineering, I moved very quickly into multiple areas and had the opportunity eventually of being able to establish an acupuncture and herbal medicine practice in Gosford and indeed on the North Shore of Sydney.
So that was the Southern Cross.
Southern Cross Herbal School came into being largely because the NHAA teaching program was floundering, in my opinion, and I decided, or we decided, the association decided that Southern Cross Herbal School would become the school teaching their program for membership purposes. And to a large extent, the course that Southern Cross Herbal School developed was a course that went on to influence, in my opinion, all subsequent courses that were taught in herbal medicine. It became the pioneer course that brought herbal medicine from an area where you picked up bits of knowledge from individual herbalists, from that sort of background into an area where students began to study and attend lectures, and studied for 3 years. The program was initially taught, as I've said, the New South Wales College of Natural Therapies, but then Southern Cross Herbal School itself became independent.
Right.
And we initially began to teach at Glebe, and I taught there for very many years. And then we moved into nature care, where for many years Southern Cross Herbal School taught its herbal medicine program as part of the nature care naturopathic program. And that was a lovely association. Students in those days would obtain a document which would have Nature Care's emblem on it and Southern Cross's emblem on it. And it was a recognition that Southern Cross would teach the herbal medicine component, but Nature Care would teach all other aspects of the naturopathic course.
Right.
And very many naturopaths gained their qualification as a result of the joint efforts of Southern Cross localising its teaching with Nature Care, initially at Chatswood and then elsewhere.
So you said at the beginning that you were quite lucky in
Yeah.
just being there at the right time.
Absolutely.
But the acceptance of herbal medicine and naturopathy back in those days, how was that compared to nowadays with the increase in research that's gone ahead? And, you know, some would argue we've needed to do that. And I wanted to get your opinion because you say in some points it's gone too far.
I think the big danger today is that herbal medicine could easily drift into what's called phytotherapy, where it turns its back to a large extent on its empirical basis. And as much as we like to dress up herbal medicine, the majority of the herbs that we use cannot be defined along the lines of single actives. And therefore, even the herbs we're talking about tonight, despite the fact that we use all sorts of scientific possibilities, at the end of the day, the herb is the herb and is represented not just by one or two of its molecules. So to an extent today, I fear that we're drifting too far in the direction of phytotherapy by trying to emphasise one or maybe two ingredients. And I'm not saying that's characteristic of this product range, but I see the drift. Now, we've come to this point, but we had to address an issue that existed previously, and that was an issue where herbal medicine had very little credibility because the older practitioners, many of whom were geniuses and very successful practitioners, I'm talking about a handful of herbalists in the early 70s that had huge practices and were making a lot of money and were very, very good at it. But what they taught was very difficult to understand. And a very formative event took place in natural medicine in the early 70s. I think it was in fact in 1970. There was what was called the Webb Committee, which met at Macquarie University. And I think it was the Whitlam government that set this organisation up with the view of looking into the credibility of natural therapies and making recommendations as to which of the natural therapies should be registered. The chiropractors and osteopaths were very well organised and they had victory, and as a result of that they became registered. The herbalists went before that committee, and I remember it well. There was a handful of us, and at the table where we all sat were a number of very eminent men, very courteous men too, not smug, very courteous. These were pharmacognosers, pharmacologists, chemists, toxicologists. And when they started to talk about herbs, many of which we knew, we suddenly realised that at one level they knew more about the herb than what we did. We were outgunned because we could not speak the language of the modern era. And as a result of that, we failed in our attempt to be taken seriously. So I determined, under the auspices of both the New South Wales College of Natural Therapies and also later on Southern Cross Herbal School, to introduce for the first time a one-semester program in what we'd probably refer to now as phytochemistry or pharmacognosy, basically introducing students to the major active principles that characterised herbs, so that when we spoke about an astringent action, we had some idea of how that astringency asserted itself by virtue of the tannin content of the herb. When we spoke about Hydrastis canadensis and its action, say, on the uterus, we had an understanding that the hydrostine alkaloid had an astringent, an aseptic effect, particularly on the hemorrhaging uterus. And so that one semester course changed the face of herbal medicine, and for the first time, in my opinion, young herbalists began to see the herb as having credibility, not just on the basis of its empirical history, but on the basis of locatable chemical constituents which, coming together, allowed the herb to work and allowed us to understand how it worked. There was never an attempt on my part at the beginning or subsequently to attempt to explain, say, golden seal purely on the action of hydrostine. What we were hypothesising was that the presence of these constituents allowed us to understand how the herb worked to some degree, never ever putting forward the idea that anything other than the herb in its entirety containing that principle would do the job. So that was an important milestone. Now I fear that perhaps we're going too far, and I look at the herb ginkgo, for instance, the 50-to-1 extract of ginkgo biloba. Now, in my opinion, it's very difficult to see how that 50-to-1 extract can be seen to be representative of normal herbal action. And here is an example of where, in my opinion, the herb has been accelerated or developed to emphasise some of its principles to the expense of others, in my opinion.
So to summarise, like, it's important for herbal medicine to embrace science, to be able to validate some of these actions, as long as it's taken in the context of the whole herb.
I think that what you say is true. I have said for years in my lecturing that there is a chapter in Rudolf Weiss's work, the classic edition of his book entitled Herbal Medicine. If you've not read that work, it needs to be read. Weiss was a brilliant medical practitioner trained in Germany and an excellent herbalist. But chapter 1 of that book, he says something very interesting about the herb. And he talks about the herbs that we use as being characterised by 3 principles: slowness of action, great safety, but complexity of chemistry, to the point of saying that arguably we might have to accept the fact that with many of the herbs that we use, if not the majority of them, we will never really be able to explain their total benefit on the basis of trying to explain it along phytochemical pathways. That empiricism, as Weiss pointed out, empiricism, that is the observed effect of the herb over many centuries. Empiricism, as Weiss points out in that book, is just as strong a pillar in the defence of herbal medicine as phytochemistry. And the older I am in the profession, after having perhaps taken herbal medicine in the direction of credibility, the older I am, the more I'm convinced that Weiss was correct and that we do ourselves a disservice by being embarrassed about not being able to totally explain the action of the herb on the basis of 1 or 2 of its principles.
And just to point out to those people who might not know the different editions that are out there, there's 2 editions of Weiss, W-E-I-S-S. One's by Tima, the silver-looking one, and the old one that Denis is talking about is the yellow one with, I think it's got a green spine, is that right? Yeah, that's the good one. Don't forget that. But I think it just encompasses how, you know, we need the credibility, we need to advance, and we need to get acceptance, or else we're going to fall by the wayside with the Webb type committee. But we must do that in the context of the whole herb.
I think you're right, but what we have to realise is that The galenical preparation, as we refer to it, a preparation which contains the total of the herb in its entirety. For instance, a liquid extract is considered to be a galenical preparation because it seeks to embody in a liquid form all that's contained in the dried herb. That is not something that's unknown. I remember a book that's still in my library somewhere by Brain and Turner, two Welsh pharmacognosers, where they defend the concept of the galenical preparation, arguing that it has an action that's credible, that is not second best, and may in fact have an action that is better in the galenical than what can be achieved by the isolation of any of its actives.
Yeah.
So remember, the galenical concept is latent even in pharmacy. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's already there. And what I would like to see our associations do is to become great defenders of the galenical concept. That's our raison d'etre. That's our raison d'etre. If we go down as herbalists, it will be because we have not adequately defended the concept of the galenical and its right to exist in the 21st century.
So just to carry on from that and just briefly before we move on. So, you know, you're well known, I think most of you who know Denis, and I think most of you do know Denis, you're well known in the industry for using liquid herbals as the mainstay of your practice. So how do you reconcile this with, you know, the new formulations that BioCeuticals has brought out?
Look,
in tablet
I am a great exponent of liquid herbals, there's no doubt about that, and I would argue that
too.
it would be impossible for me to sustain a practice without a liquid herbal dispensary. But anyone that knows my background will know that I was one of the first to embrace the encapsulated herb, because there are many people in our society, particularly a modern society, who literally can't handle liquid herbs. And what I'm finding in practice is that is accelerating.
Wives, husbands, sons, daughters.
Our society is becoming very soft.
Yeah.
And whereas 35 years ago, people were prepared to wear the taste of something, these days the softness of our society requires solid forms which bypassed the taste. So I've always had in my dispensary a range of solid form preparations. I couldn't practice without them, and sometimes my conclusion of a consultation will be the facilitating of a solid form. The other thing that is important to realise is this, that liquid extracts in this country are becoming exceedingly expensive. And this is because of all sorts of things. By the time the dried herb is imported to Australia, by the time it goes through middlemen who have to make their money on it, supplying it to the manufacturer, and by the time that herb is converted into a liquid extract, the cost of it is accelerated dramatically. Dramatically. So that liquid extracts today, particularly if you're using full strength ones, one-to-one, and I've always ever used one-to-one, and students that know my argument that if you're using 1 and 2s, fine, but look at your dosage. Now, if you're using, therefore, liquid extracts, you are confronted with the reality that unless you are using less concentrated extracts, the cost of the extract is becoming very high, whereas manufacturers can bring in from overseas, from countries that haven't got the high cost structure, high quality powdered extracts, high quality stuff, stuff from India, and you might raise your eyebrow when we say China, but high quality stuff from India and China and other places, you can bring in starting material in a powdered form which a company can take and convert into a tablet or a capsule and present a preparation of that much less expensively than what it would to present it in a liquid extract form. So the cost factor works against liquid extract prescribing because of the way in which in Australia we're at the end of the line, and to turn a herb into a litre of a liquid extract, you're looking at about $40.
That's huge, isn't it?
That's huge.
I think everybody would take their point tonight about treating family. Do you always get that hurdle?
So when we look at, for instance, the bioceutical range, and I do use that range, as you know, I use many ranges, but if you look at the bioceutical range, it's a very economical range. And I don't say that because I'm paid to say it. I'm not paid to do anything, I'm my own man. But if you look at the cost structure of some of the preparations in your product range, they are very, very economical and could be passed on in an unembarrassed way to a consumer. Whereas one of the things that embarrasses me in practice is that standard herbal medicine practice, particularly structured around the extracts, is embarrassing for increasing numbers of Australians that just haven't got the money for private medicine.
Yeah, yeah. So, thanks for that. I think what we're going to do now is we're going to cover 3 broad topics, or 3 specific topics, that are huge issues, huge health issues in today's society, with huge healthcare burdens, healthcare dollar burdens to each of them. And I think if we start off with depression, and so forgive me, we were going to sit the opposite side, but I got off the Black Dog Institute, and this sort of goes against some of the thinking with, you know, what's called DSM-5 now, and even DSM-4, and this is an earlier notion presented by Professor Gordon Parker, and he describes on the Black Dog website, which I do encourage you to look at, 4 types of depression. So you've got your atypical, and we'll be sending you out some notes about this later, so don't fret if you don't get it, but you know, they're all on the Black Dog website. So the atypical depression, and there's different characteristics of this. They tend to have, they sleep more rather than having insomnia. They tend to eat more rather than have anorexia. There's a few other interesting things happening where they tend to be more inflammatory driven. Then you get your mild and then your severe depression and your psychotic depression. And that the very severe depression is, Gordon Parker wants to bring back the term melancholia. So it's a different, a very deep depression. But I was going to ask you, when you see these patients come in, how do they present? And some of it would be an obvious thing, but how do you find these people presenting to you in the different types?
Okay. The way in which what we refer to as depression manifests itself, in my thinking, even transcends that which the good professor has said.
Yep.
What worries me about the attempts to put these things into so many different boxes is that we're tending to lose the overview of the condition and being perhaps too selective in putting people into a category rather than looking at the presentation of the symptoms that the patient presents and the need of the moment. From my own point of view, with reference to depression, I've had a lot of experience with this. We've seen it in our family, so I speak from personal experience. There is no one more conservative in the treating of depression than myself. I'm aware that in our society today, as one headmaster at a school in Newcastle said recently, youth suicide is happening at the rate of nearly 1 a month. So when I take on depression, or if I take it on, I don't take it on in any sort of nonchalant way. It takes a lot of thinking on my part to determine where I will come in and if indeed I will treat. I don't think, and I'll come back to your question in a moment, I don't think that practitioners, complementary practitioners, call us what you like, I don't think many practitioners have experienced the level of anxiety and depressional states that will present in a practice. And what worries me is younger practitioners who have not been exposed to the hospital system, who know very little about mental health, could easily find themselves in deep water by taking on and trying to treat a condition that really needs to be managed much more medically. I see people in psychotic states if a person presents to me who is obviously psychotic, and I'm very good at being able to recognise that, again, from a personal family perspective, the first thing that I want to know is what level of management this person is having. If he's not having any management and he's psychotic, I won't treat. I won't treat. If a person presents who has depression, I will want to know, if he uses those terms or if I perceive that there is depression, I will want to know what is the scope of his management. Because I don't think these days depression, anxiety, is a condition that yields to the skills of one person. I am more at home these days when a person presents who is being well monitored by an empathetic GP, who has had enough enthusiasm to recommend that patient to appropriate psychology, and where there's also a recognition at this stage that being monitored, being helped by the psychologist, that a softer system of medicine might be useful to start to use, rather than going down the pathway of the well-known pharmaceutical medications that are used.
Yeah.
I feel very comfortable about working in that situation where I know that the patient is being primarily managed within the mainstream, and that I've been called upon and expected to help by offering something that fits into that multifactorial system of management. So that's where I start my practice thing. I'm very selective in whom I treat.
Yeah.
Many cases will present, even without a medical diagnosis, where my skill after 35 years allows me to see that this case and my dialogue with the patient allows me to offer them something that will take the edge of what they're experiencing and give them the time and the release from their symptoms that's needed for them to pick themselves up. And in that situation, I fall back on the prescribing of some herbs. But I'm very quick to point out that I think that to see ourselves as prime contact therapists for depressional states, that needs to be cautious and with a question mark beside it. And I'd pass that on to younger practitioners in particular. Now, there are many cases where depression is used where perhaps it's the wrong term to use. For instance, some of the symptoms that are presented in the context of the period, premenstrual depression it used to be called, where there is obviously something happening in the lady's cycle that sees her mood change, where she does manifest symptoms that are not usually hers. In that context, herbal medicine can work particularly well, and my protocol there will be structured round herbs which are in your range, Vitex as a liquid, which is in your range. I don't think we appreciate to this day the benefit that Vitex has in overcoming some of the hormonal factors that contribute towards the moods that some ladies experience. And preparations that contain St John's wort usually allow most patients that I treat with that condition to do better than what they were previously doing. And that combination of medication based or structured round Hypericum St John's wort, reinforced by Vitex agnus castus, I still argue is an undiscovered gem in the management of many conditions loosely known as depressional states that ladies experience. So the preparation that you're producing with St John's wort in it, and with some of the more novel so-called antidepressant remedies, is an ideal companion remedy in my perspective for managing something like hormonally based depression
Yeah.
in a lady, where the preparation in conjunction with the Vitex drops, I'd be surprised if that did see some good results in the majority of women that present with that level of so-called depression. But outside of that, I tread cautiously.
Yeah. So do you see that stress, overall stress, it's an obvious sentence, I get that, but that stress is a major component, and therefore to add an adaptogen,
Oh, yes.
like rhodiola or ginsengs or something like that, do you
Totally.
commonly add those in?
I would argue that the use of the adaptogen is still poorly understood. I read Mill's years ago, and I still consider Mill's literature some of the best and straightforward in the Anglo-American system of herbalism.
Mm.
Mill's I read on adaptogens very, very early in my career. The idea of a remedy that can work non-specifically in helping the body adjust to physical and mental stress is something that's unique to our system of medicine. Adaptogenic
Absolutely.
action is what it says. It assists the body in adapting and so forth, and in preparations, therefore, that purport to address depression with so-called specific antidepressant remedies must necessarily, in my opinion, be supported by an adaptogen. Necessarily.
And I think, especially in light that I think it's 40% of medication intervention in moderate to severe depression fails. 40%, huge failure rate. So it's not something that doctors feel that they've got all the answers to as well. And I think when we're in the 21st century with this huge stress that's overwhelming us all, if we can add these adaptogens in, I think it adds an extra facet to their treatment, helps them.
Oh, look, on the notes that I made in surveying your range of products, the NeuroBalance product, that is a good product. It's got all the right herbs in it. I made a little note here that if I were using it, which I do, I'd immediately be thinking around 3 supportive remedies, particularly the Adrenoplex remedy. I'd be thinking of that. Also the Femiplex, particularly with its premenstrual connotations, and Menopause, particularly where you're dealing with some ladies that are doing it tough as they're going through the menopause. So the adaptogen is just one of a number of remedies that could be easily used to make that preparation, NeuroBalance, work particularly well. No one has, well, I shouldn't say that, but your point about the way in which mainstream medicine doesn't necessarily get the results right is well known. And this is why I feel much more comfortable in dealing with people that present with various shades of anxiety and depression, of trying to address it at a multifactorial level. My practice or my treatment for people presenting with that level of distress just isn't in the prescribing of herbs. One thing I would like to think has happened in my career, which now is about 35 years, is that as a result of a lot of reading and a lot of understanding of the human condition, you can bring that to bear in better being able to help a person. And my prescribing of natural medication, particularly to address something like a depressional situation or an anxiety state, would always be prefaced by a significant period of time spent with the person, travelling some distance with them, introducing them to some concepts. I think if you're going to help people with these sorts of things, and I don't want to turn this into a religious thing, but you have to have some sort of spiritual input. You have to have some sort of counselling skill. You have to have a good handle on understanding the human condition in the 21st century. And my argument is that a lot of young GPs coming out of medical school and a lot of young naturopaths and herbalists, unfortunately, haven't been able yet to pick up the sorts of skills that are needed to make a softer medication work more effectively.
Yeah.
So I would pass on to all listening tonight, if you are to make people better, in inverted commas, with remedies used to address anxiety and depression, it must be seen in the context of multifactorial activity and of the prescribing of what you're offering. It should be couched always from the perspective of meaningful counselling, an understanding of their social situation. There's no use trying to give someone a medication if they're a single parent battling to survive. They want something more than that. You need to talk, you need to open up doors, you need to be aware of what avenues there are to help people. I find in practice these days this is the new ball game. You meet people at that level, understanding the human condition allows you to get a better result with natural medicine, which works beautifully with it.
I remember reading something years ago, probably about 10 years ago, where they're saying one of the major differences, and forgive the GPs that are caught in the machine, if you like, but one of the attractions to naturopaths that patients had was the amount of time that they spent with them listening. And unfortunately, GPs are really on the treadmill trying to do their medicine and make the statistics look good for Medicare and that. But so I don't denigrate the GPs at all. They're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. But I think listening is a really big.
I have more regard for general practitioners and what they do in our community than I have ever had in my life.
Yeah.
And I've had the fortune and the pleasure to be able to help many of them understand our system of medicine. And even my own GP did a course in Ayurvedic medicine with me. The ordinary GP is under an incredible amount of pressure, and I suspect this is why the government has encouraged general practitioners to refer on to other members of the healthcare team, allied healthcare professions, such as the psychologist. And I would like to think that we could be seen in that perspective. Give an example of what I'm talking about on the need to develop life skills and practice skills in being able to help people. There's a dear soul in Newcastle who I have been seeing for over 20 years. One of the most well-educated people I've met, a French lady by extraction, very intelligent. The loss of her husband sent her into psychosis. And she would come into my rooms at New Lambton in an extremely psychotic state, to the extent that many in the consulting room would be fearful. I understood Monique so well that within half a minute in my room, she could be quietened, we would be talking, and she would ask about my son. And that dialogue has continued. What disappointed me was the way in which over many years, both medically and with natural medicine, she'd been abused. Anyone that saw her coming would do anything to get rid of her by loading her up with things she didn't need to take or putting her on heavy medication that wiped her out. Monique is doing very, very well now. She's seeing a good psychiatrist. Her medication has been levelled out. She rings me up regularly, always inquires after my son and my dear wife. But the interesting thing is, as a result of understanding something of her condition, what brought it on, taking her seriously and listening to the wealth of information she had to pass on, that's something which has been a real privilege. And I would like to think, in this case, not what I prescribed, but what I listened to and what I was happy to listen to, probably helped her more than anything I prescribed.
Can I just go back to a point you made earlier about some of the novel herbs that are in use in the NeuroBalance product?
Yeah.
So many of you may not know that saffron is now available on the Australian market, and there's research going ahead at Melbourne University. Some of it's already been done, and certainly interest by Associate Professor Leslie Braun and also Jerome Saris, who's a naturopath working in the Department of Psychiatry there. So there's these newer herbs, new kids on the block. You know, you've got your mimosa, which is watch me tongue tie this one. It's one of the Albizia
Yes.
genus, and the species is called Julibrisson. So it's related to what we term Albizia for allergies. We'll just talk about that later, but it's a different species. The saffron we've just mentioned, but the mimosa I thought was very interesting in that in TCM it's in the realm of what calms the spirit. And I think that's an interesting point when we're talking about inflammatory-based depressive disorders, and especially with regards to the cardiovascular issues that can happen. I think that's a really interesting... I don't know of any research on it, but...
Well, that was one thing that impressed me about that particular product, that sure, the product is spearheaded by the major remedy, say hypericum, but round it are some very innovative remedies. Herbal medicine never stands still. What's happening today is multiculturalism and globalisation has brought into our realm knowledge pertaining to perfectly legitimate remedies that have been outside the predominantly English-speaking system of herbalism. And I think BioCeuticals is to be commended for the way in which it's done its research, which I've read, and it has incorporated into a product such as this some of the newer remedies from different traditions that would reinforce the major remedy that's doing the job of work. Well done.
One of the cautions, though, with regards to St John's wort is because it has this potential interaction with existing SSRIs or SNRIs or whatever if they're on an antidepressant medication, that if they're going to, if they wanted to use the natural medicine, then they should wean off the SSRI or the SNRI with the knowledge of their doctor or psychiatrist or psychologist, and then have a gap and then wean on to the product that contains St John's wort. So there is that potential interaction. One of the interesting things, though, is the role of zinc, which is, we don't often think about zinc for depression, and yet there's some research showing that zinc helps existing medications to work better. And this goes along that old premise of enzymes. You know, over 100 different enzymes in the body, zinc helps. So I think that's an interesting thing, that you've got something for those people that wish to or need to stay on their existing medication and can't or won't come off. And then there is an answer, one possible answer for those people that want to wean on. Would you agree with that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think I do.
Would you agree with that weaning, with that 2-week period? It's always confused me.
Well, I think what you're saying is largely correct. I think you have to be very cautious when a patient presents who's on psychotropic medication. Any attempt to bring any competing medication into the process is potentially fraught with problems. I would be reluctant to prescribe psychotropic medication to a patient who is still taking and dependent on medically prescribed medication. What I am happy to do is for a patient to present who says, look, I've discussed with my GP or my psychiatrist my desire to come down from this medication. I feel as though I'm ready to come down, and they agree. That's when I'm quite happy to prescribe, and even there, I'm happier if it's done with their medical people monitoring it. I would prefer, in fact, them to be off their medication prior to the introduction of something like neurobalance.
Do you agree with a 2-week gap, if you like?
And sometimes a bit longer. Sometimes a bit longer. I think the thing here is the patient needs to be given an opportunity, in my view, to see whether or not they are secure in their ability now to cope with what the prescribed medication may have done for them. And they need to see whether in fact they need to be on anything. It might be more appropriate at the end of that washout period, so to speak, to suggest that they use an adaptogenic
I
remedy
was just going to ask.
rather than put them onto something
Yeah.
that would seek to assume that they were still in need of psychotropic medication. I think the idea locked away in the adrenoplex remedy is fantastic and should perhaps be seen as certainly a contribution that we can make to a patient regardless of whether they are on mainstream medication or not. So I think the washout period is a good concept, and very frequently the use of something adaptogenic rather than a competing softer antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication would be good.
I do like the energetics of the American ginseng, which, you know, we're all keyed into ginseng being a heating type herb. It's not necessarily so. The energetics of the American ginseng is more of a cooling herb, and it's more of a mind herb rather than an energy herb. I think it's really energetic. I do love the stuff on American ginseng.
One of the things that in your preparation, the rhodiola, now that has got some unique characteristics. If you look at rhodiola, you'll see that it is an adaptogen, but it's more than that. It goes beyond just supporting the adrenal axis. It does bring with it some calming, antidepressant characteristics. Its psychotropic chemistry is not vivid, but there is an edge to it that gives to that preparation a real possibility of helping someone before they are necessarily prescribed something more antidepressant than what they're presently taking.
Yeah, and I think just to wrap that up, you know, I really do applaud the most recent endeavours by Beyond Blue with Dr. Ironwood. Ironwood. Have you seen the ad? You know, it's a brilliant ad that's getting into the hearts of men and getting them to open up. I really do applaud that initiative. So let's wrap up depression and melancholia and move on to something just as depressing. And that is the absolute explosion of obesity, diabetes and blood sugar dysregulation that we have in Australia. Now, of course, we're the fifth fattest country in the world. At one stage we were touted as the fattest, but it's not so now. We're the fifth fattest country in the world. There's the AusDiab trial run by the Baker's Heart Institute, or the Baker's IDI as it's now called. 1.7 million people in Australia that's diagnosed and estimated to suffer from type 2 diabetes. 1.7 million people in Australia, and that is projected to double by the year 2035. Huge healthcare dollars. I think it was 45 billion by 2025 it was projected. Those figures do not include those with pre-diabetes and insulin resistance, which is another whole population on its own. And of course the blood sugar irregularities, which are treated as remedial, but they're obviously a sign of things to come. So again, what do you see with these patients presenting, apart from the obvious, or let's go with the obvious as well, but include that. What other things do you see?
Well, type 2 is probably one of the most common presentations that I see in practice.
Have they been caught first, or do you catch them because of some other?
Normally what happens here is that they will have been, or they've presented to their GP, who in the context of investigation has discovered that they're borderline, or in fact they are type 2, and the GP rightly being their prime contact therapist and legally the only one entitled to treat diabetes, the GP said, look, I don't want to go down the pathway of medication, neither do you. Give yourself a chance with lifestyle modification and with herbs, increasingly where I am, maybe due to my presence in the Hunter region for 35 years, the opposition to using herbs in the context of lifestyle modification is really not there. So a patient will present and I'll start a little program with them. But let me be quick to point out the way in which type 2 and other blood sugar irregularities have been too frequently or too quickly put in the context of obesity is so frequently contradicted in my practice that I think we have to be cautious that we don't just see it associated with obesity. I see people that are huge. The Hunter Valley is renowned for having big people. Not all of them are diabetic. A very elderly friend of ours who goes to our church is a lady who's in her mid-80s and will be twice my size, and yet has a blood sugar level that I'd be give my teeth for, so to speak.
Right.
And I had a patient recently who, thin, lean, trim, passed out, hospitalised, and in the context of investigation, found that he was diabetic, and his GP had never really taken into account the possibility that he was so.
Yeah.
So I think we've got to be careful that we don't, with this burgeoning explosion, just see it related to simple things. I think it's more complex than that. We're living a lot longer.
Yeah.
So people are going to die of something, and people are going to get diseases, which my grandfather, who died at 65, a generation ago, would unlikely have experienced. But having said that, it is a situation that is presenting increasingly in my practice, whereas 35 years ago, I rarely saw it. I will obviously not treat type 1 diabetes, that's medically restricted. But my approach is very simple. I'm type 2 myself, and so I know a little bit about what to do here, and because of my type 2 problem, which people hear about on my radio program, people come to me with great confidence because they know that what I tell them I'm doing myself.
Yeah.
And if people present, if we'll restrict our discussion to type 2, if people present with type 2, I will only take them on board if they agree to do a number of things. Continue being monitored by the general practitioner. Secondarily, become interested in learning about type 2 diabetes and bringing into play lifestyle changes, particularly at the dietary level, that will help see their blood sugar levels retreat. And so the first thing I do to patients that present is get them working, and I use Dr. Cabot's book, which is easily read, on type 2 diabetes. I stock it, I sell it to my patients, I use it myself. It's a great little work. I get them to read it and understand what's going on, and to look at the dietary ideas in it, and also the herbs that are in it, because the herbs that are in it are basically the herbs that are in your preparation and that I use. So I will not take them on unless they're prepared to become self-educated.
Yeah, good.
I just don't want to be another prescribing person. The second thing that I insist on is they start to use the AccuCheck. And the doctor has told them that in most cases already. Become involved, start to get your readings going. I do mine every morning, as my wife knows, religiously, together with the blood pressure, and get them to start to log their fasting levels at least once a day, and begin to see some of the changes that can take place. And then, in the context of that little trilogy, I will bring in the herbs that are in your great little product. I will bring in the bitter melon. I've done a lot of work on bitter melon. I was one of the first to begin to actually use it seriously and develop my own powdered preparation on it and wrote my own paper on it. So bitter melon, Mamortica charantia, universally recognised, particularly in the third world, increasingly documented, has been clinically shown to be capable of significantly lowering the blood sugar level. Now, there have been numerous attempts to explain how bitter melon achieves this, and I'm intrigued by the way in which the scientific jargon puts forward hypotheses and usually couches it with terms like it could be, or it might be, or it is hypothesised. Bitter melon, for God's sake, is a food. It has multiple molecules. It certainly can be extracted and converted into a powdered preparation that you use in your good preparation. But how it achieves that result, who cares? It just achieves it.
Yeah.
And
It's been used for
to give bitter melon credibility on the basis of its phytochemistry, to my way of thinking, would be little less than ludicrous. I used a book a couple of years ago for a Melbourne seminar on cancer. The name of the book was Foods That Fight Cancer, by the two Canadian PhDs, Bellevue and I can't think of the other guy's name, Gingras. A book that needs to be read by anyone who's seriously seeking to help people at the nutritional level. And at the end of that book, the two PhDs working in Quebec put pay to any idea that any food could be reduced to any one single molecule.
Absolutely.
And laughed at the attempt to see, for instance, the tomato represented entirely by lycopene. So my approach is to use preparations that you've got in your great preparation, and I commend you, the bitter melon, as, what can you say? It's, on its own, it's one of the best things that you could possibly work with. So that's the spearhead of your formula, I presume, and the other remedies that surround it reinforce its action.
Yeah. So with regards to the other ones, just so to let everybody know, there's the go through. You've got your Jim Nema, good old Jim Nema.
Now,
I was going to ask you about Jim Nema,
Yeah.
about how do you differentiate between a tablet action and a fluid extract action?
Okay.
Do you find a use for both, or do you prefer one over the other?
I wish you hadn't asked that question. I'm torn between two opinions. The taste of something must have some consequence. And so in as much that with a liquid extract you certainly know you taste it, if taste means anything, and Mills said in one of his references, I think he said that he referred to something as the pharmacology of taste. The bitter melon powder that I produced tastes horrible, but yet I saw a producer of my radio program who tracked round 18 with his blood sugar levels. I saw that drop to 8 as a result of taking 5 grams of the powder. On the other hand, and that tends to confirm my idea about the taste, but on the other hand, I've been disappointed by my enthusiasm about taste, because it's terrible stuff to take. And I take a preparation that contains it in a tablet, and my blood sugar level travels pretty well.
Yeah.
So I think at the end of the day, either form.
Yeah. With Jim Nema, I was just wondering about, just quickly maybe, if you had somebody who had a sugar fix, maybe it was worthwhile using the fluid extract to get that. Has anybody used Jim Nema here? Can you hands up? Just for those people who haven't, if you swish it around your mouth for about 30 seconds, you can take a teaspoon of sugar and it tastes like sand. There is no sweet sensation. It's gone. And so I'm wondering about if somebody has a sugar addiction.
I don't think the effect is sustained long enough.
No? Okay.
And this is where I would take issue with some of the appetite suppressant medications round
Right.
that push it as a remedy reducing sugar craving. In my opinion, and I've got to be cautious what I say, in my opinion, that's pushing that.
So you think
experience.
the longer action type?
Yeah,
of it?
look, I think it does. It's very similar to the effect of echinacea. You're supposed to get a tingling sensation with reference to echinacea, but what I mean, those effects are momentarily. I'm not sure that there's any sustained. Look, if a person comes to me who's worried about weight loss, I certainly don't put them onto the fluid extract of that preparation.
Right.
I think that would be wrong, and I've not seen any evidence to suggest that using the herb in that liquid form could be seen to have any significant appetite suppressant action. That's an opinion.
No, that's fine. So just to round off that bit, we haven't talked about just briefly fenugreek, and I did want to cover this because this is important.
Yep.
It's an important herb.
You and I had some discussions about this some time ago, and I've always been an exponent of fenugreek, but I've always been an exponent of it in substantial dosages. I get a reputation in this industry for high dosages, and I have had a lot to do with fenugreek in importing a French powdered preparation, which is very good for addressing this problem, where it's used in significant gram dosages. So I have been naturally biased towards seeing fenugreek being used in much higher dosages than what's in your preparation. However, there is a good argument from the literature, a good argument from the literature to say that fenugreek's action is not entirely based on its mucilaginous chemistry. The high dosage of fenugreek would see it work by virtue of the high content of the mucilage interfering with carbohydrate metabolism. There are other actives in fenugreek which perhaps permit us to say that that which is available in the literature, i.e. lower dosages, can work effectively, particularly when in conjunction with other remedies that are addressing the same problem. So
most of the data, though, is the high dosage. I think there's a small amount of data using a lower dosage of the fenugreek with a dyslipidemia type profile, is it? Yeah. So maybe you'd think about the lower dosage with those people that don't have just the blood sugar issues, but also have a dyslipidemic type profile. And just to round this off, because we do have to break quickly, the new glucofactors fort, which has been totally redeveloped, incling that bitter melon, which you love so much.
That is
and I've got to say, I've been a fan of this for years.
That is a very good preparation. As I say, I'm not paid to push anyone's product, but if a product is good, I will defend it and use it. And that product, as you know, is in my dispensary. But what I'm impressed about that product is also that it draws on the old and the inclusion of goat's rue. If you look at goat's rue, Galiga officinalis, in the British Herbal Pharmacopoeia of 1983, you'll have one of the most confirming monographs on seeing goat's rue for what it is. A reliable remedy to be monitored. The literature, the pharmacopoeia, insists that blood sugar levels be monitored closely as a result of using Galiga. So the inclusion, yes, very much so, it could get away on you. So the inclusion of Galiga impresses me, because these days it's not taught widely.
It's used for different things now, isn't it?
Beg your pardon?
It's used as a galactagogue.
That's
almost.
correct.
And it's lost that history.
It's lost its primary use, which is in the area of being an effective, older-fashioned hypoglycemic remedy. Read the BHP of 1983. If you haven't got that text, regardless of what you're being taught, get a copy.
We need to get a site link for the British Herbal Pharmacopoeia of
1983. In my opinion, all other editions, regardless of what other teachers might tell you, in my opinion, the 1983 edition is still the landmark work which changed the direction of herbal medicine in the English-speaking world.
And so, again, just to finish off this subject before we break, so the glucofactors has also got the chromium picolinate, so it's changed, and includes the biotin, and that's in line with the diachrome study. And the diachrome study is very interesting. It used 600 micrograms of chromium picolinate, which is illegal in Australia. We're restricted to 50 micrograms per dose. But we do bump that up with, if you like, the poor sister, the chromic chloride. And then obviously there's the 1 milligram of biotin in each tablet there. So that sort of goes along the lines of what's called the diachrome study, if you want to look that up. And we'll be sending some information out to you about this. But also, importantly, the alpha-lipoic acid. And I didn't want to get into an argument about R versus S, but basically it's this. The plethora of research is done on the RS, that's the racemic mix, and especially with regards to what's called the Aladdin 1 and 2 trials in diabetic patients, where they used 600 milligrams and then they doubled or tripled it. They didn't get huge increments of control with those higher dosages, but you can increase it to, like, 800 if you've got somebody that's really hard to control. But 600 was basically the level at which it's stopped at for its therapeutic effect. You don't get great increments. So the Aladdin 1 and 2 trials were very interesting. And just really briefly, where do you see the limitations in this sort of treatment?
There are always limitations, particularly with diabetes, and I think we need to recognise that diabetes is one of those diseases that is restricted to medical management. So any attempt to become a person functioning independently is fraught with problems. I would certainly not be happy in treating or taking on board people with type 1. These days people live and live long and live well as a result of modern medications, and that is something that is important to me. 35 years in this system of medicine has allowed me to appreciate the great benefits of modern medicine. So I'm reluctant to do anything there. If a patient is not compliant, I'm not interested in them. If they don't want to see that I'm not going to give them a magic pill that's going to stop them going towards metformin, if they see that if I'm not going to do that, well, they're going to have to go back and just take that medication. So I would prevaricate if a patient was not happy to see me more as an educator and see the herbs that I'm prescribing more as medicinal foods, and with them being monitored by their GP, with their own diarising of the condition, evidencing to their GP as well as to me that their type 2 tendency is being well managed, well controlled, and not putting themselves or anyone into danger. But what I would say here with reference to diabetes, I say it on my radio program, I say it in my lectures. I believe that there are two herbs that are the most important herbs for the diabetic, regardless of whether they're type 1 or type 2. I believe any helping of, and I'll use that term, any attempt to help a diabetic patient that doesn't incorporate the ginkgo and the bilberry is negligent. And you've got an excellent product which incorporates those products, antioxidant product. And Pizzorno and Murray, in their book, Encyclopedia of Natural Medicine, which Southern Cross used for years, still an excellent text. I don't know whether it's being used in naturopathic teaching places these days, but
I think so.
It should be.
Yeah.
But Pizzorno and Murray, in their discussion on diabetes, point out the benefits of these two remedies in helping withstand the horrors of the diabetic patients, peripheral circulatory disorders and diabetic retinopathies. And so even if the advice that you give to a person presenting is just to encourage them to use those remedies as presented in your antioxidant Excel product, you've done a lot. And if the patient is working well at that level, being monitored, doing their AccuChecks each morning, looking at their diet, following the ideas that the good Dr. Cabot has mentioned in a book, doing their exercise, keeping in touch with their GP, keeping in touch with their diabetic nurse, you've helped that patient incredibly, much more than what could have been done years ago.
Thanks, Dennis. So guys, I think you're getting an idea about 35 years of day in, day out practice, aren't you? So what we'll do is we'll take a short break. If we could limit it to please 10 minutes, because we are running a little bit behind schedule. If we could limit it to 10 minutes and be back by, say, 20 past, we'll start on the second round with Denis Stewart.